Hello and welcome to Mahatma Gandhi Letters. Dear listeners, let's get into the second part of the article, the Indian franchise, an appeal to every Briton in South Africa. Gandhi continues, "This country shall be and remain a white man's country and not a black man's, and the Indian franchise will simply swamp the European vote and give the Indian the political supremacy in Natal." With the first part of the statement, I do not propose to deal. I confess that I do not even understand it fully. I would, however, try to remove the misconception that underlies the latter part of the statement. I venture to say that the Indian vote can never swamp the European vote, and that the idea of the Indian trying to claim political supremacy is contrary to all past experience. I have had the honor to talk to many Europeans with reference to this question, and almost all have argued upon the assumption that there is one man, one vote in the colony. That there is a property qualification was an information to them. I must, therefore, be pardoned for reproducing here the section of the franchise law dealing with the qualification. Every man, except as hereafter excepted, above the age of 21 years, who possesses an immovable property to the value of £50, or who rents any such property of the yearly value of £10 within any electoral district, and who is duly registered in the manner hereinafter mentioned, shall be entitled to vote at the election of a member for such district. When any such property as aforesaid is occupied by more persons than one as proprietors or renters, each of such occupants being duly registered, shall be entitled to vote in respect of such property, provided the value, or as the case may be, the rent thereof, be such as would entitle each of such joint occupants to vote if equally divided among them. From this it is clear that it is not every Indian who can get the franchise. And how many Indians are there in the colony compared with the Europeans who have immovable property of the value of £50 or who rent such property of the yearly value of £10? This law has been in force for a long time, and the following table will give some idea of the relative strength of the European and the Indian franchise. I have compiled the table from the latest lists published in the Gazette, in which European voters are around 9,500, where Indian voters are around 250. Thus, out of 9,560 registered voters, only 251 are Indians, and only 2 divisions have Indian voters worth mentioning. The proportion of Indian voters to the European, roughly speaking, is 1 of 38th, i.e., the European vote at present is 38 times as strong as the Indian vote. According to the report of the Protector of Indian Immigrants for 1895, out of the total Indian population of 46,343, only 30,303 are free Indians. Adding to this the trading Indian population of, say, 5,000, we have roughly 35,000 freed and free Indians. At present, therefore, the Indian population that may compete with the European population as to voting is not so large as the European. But I believe I am not wide of the mark in saying that more than half of the 35,000 are only a stage higher than the indentured Indians in point of pecuniary circumstances. I have been traveling in the districts surrounding and within 50 miles of Durban, and I may safely venture to assert that most of the Indians who are free are living from hand to mouth and certainly have not immovable property worth £50. Free Indian adults in the colony number only 12,360. Thus, I submit that the fears as to the Indian vote swamping the European in the near future are entirely groundless. The following analysis of the Indian voters list further shows that most of the Indian voters are those Indians who have settled in the colony for a very long time. That out of 205 whom I have been able to get identified, only 35 have been at one time indentured Indians, and that they have all been in the colony for over 15 years. Of course, this table cannot by any means be said to be absolutely correct. I think, however, it is accurate enough for the present purpose. Thus, so far as these figures go, the Indians who come under indenture take 15 years or more to be able to have sufficient property qualifications to get on the voters' roll. And if the freed Indian population were accepted, no one can say that the trading population alone can ever swamp the voters' roll. Moreover, most of these 35 freed Indians have risen to the status of traders. Of those who have originally come on their own means, a large majority have taken a long time to be able to get on the voters' roll. Of the 46 whom I have not been able to get identified, a great many by their names appear to belong to the trading class. There are many colonial-born Indians in the colony. They are also educated, and yet on the voters' roll there are only 9. This would show that they are too poor to have the sufficient qualifications. On the whole, therefore, it would seem that taking the present list as a basis, the fears as to the Indian vote assuming threatening proportions are imaginary. Of the 205, over 40 are either dead or have left the colony. The following table is an analysis of the Indian voters list according to their occupation, which says trading class Indian are 151, clerks and assistants are 50, gardeners and others are 50. This analysis also ought, I think, to assist unbiased men in removing their fears as to the voters list being swamped by undeserving or lowest class Indians. 4. By far the greatest number belongs to the trading or the so-called Arab class, who at any rate are acknowledged to be not quite unfit to vote. Those classified under the second heading either belong to the trader class or to that class of Indians who have received a tolerably good English education. Those belonging to the third division may be termed laborers of a higher order, far above the average indentured Indian. They are those who have settled in the colony for over 20 years with their families and either own property or pay good rents. I may say also that, if my information be correct, most of these voters can read and write their own mother tongue. Thus, if the present Indian voters list is to serve as a guide for the future, and assuming that the franchise qualification remains as it is, the list is very satisfactory from a European standpoint. First, because numerically the voting strength of the Indians is very poor. And secondly, because most of the Indian voters belong to the trading class. It should also be borne in mind that the number of the trading Indians in the colony will remain almost the same for a long time. For while many come every month, an equal number leaves for India. As a rule, the incoming ones take the place of the outgoing ones. So far, I have not imported the natural proclivities of the two communities into the argument at all, but have merely dealt with the figures. Yet, the natural proclivities will have not a little to do with the political activity of the two. There cannot be two opinions about the fact that the Indians, as a rule, do not actively meddle with politics. They have never tried to usurp political power anywhere. Their religion, no matter whether it be Mohammedan or Hindu, the teaching of ages cannot be obliterated by a mere change of name, teaches them indifference to material pursuits. Naturally, they are satisfied so long as they can earn a respectable living. I take the liberty to say that had not an attempt been made to tread upon their commercial pursuits, had not attempts been made and repeated to degrade them to the condition of pariahs of society, had not, in fact, an attempt been made to keep them forever hewers of wood and drawers of water, i.e. in a state of indenture or in one very much resembling it, there would have been no franchise agitation. I would go further. I have no hesitation in saying that even now there is no political agitation in the real sense of the term. But an attempt is, most unfortunately, being made by the press to father, as it were, such an agitation upon the Indians. Leave them to follow their legitimate pursuits. Do not attempt to degrade them. Treat them with ordinary kindness. And there would be no franchise question, simply because they would not even take the trouble to have their names on the voters' roll. But it has been said, and that too by responsible persons, that a few Indians want political power, and that these few are Mohammedan agitators, and that the Hindus should learn from past experience that the Mohammedan rule will be ruinous for them. The first statement is without foundation, and the last statement is most unfortunate and painful. To gain political power is entirely impossible if gaining political power means entrance into the legislative assembly. Such a statement presupposes the presence in the colony of very wealthy Indians having a competent knowledge of the English language. Now, there are very few wealthy, as distinguished from well-to-do, Indians in the colony. and there is perhaps none capable of discharging the duties of a legislator, not because there is none capable of understanding politics, but because there is none possessing such a knowledge of the English language as would be expected of a legislator. The second statement is an attempt to set the Hindus against the Mohammedans in the colony. How any responsible man in the colony can wish for such a calamity is very wonderful. Such attempts have been attended by the most grievous results in India and have even threatened the permanence of British rule. To make them in this colony where the two sects are living most amicably is, I venture to say, most mischievous. It is a healthy sign that it is now recognized that to debar all Indians from the franchise would be a grievous injustice. Some think that the so-called Arabs should be allowed the franchise. Some think there should be a selection made among them. And some think that the indentured Indians should never be able to get the franchise. The latest suggestion comes from Stanger and is most humorous. If that suggestion were to be followed, those alone who could prove that they were voters in India would be entitled to it in natal. Why such a rule for the poor Indians alone? I do not think they would object to such an arrangement if it were applicable to all. And I should not be surprised if the Europeans also were to find it difficult to get their names on the voter list in the colony under such conditions. For how many Europeans are there in the colony who were on the voters list in the states they have come from? If, however, the statement were made with regard to the Europeans, it would be received with the strongest indignation. It has been received seriously with regard to the Indians. It has also been stated that the Indians agitate for one Indian, one vote. I submit that the statement is without the slightest foundation and is calculated to create unnecessary prejudice against the Indian community. I believe that the present property qualification is sufficient, at any rate for the present, if not for all time, to maintain the superior numerical strength of the European vote. If, however, the European colonists think otherwise, no Indian, I think, will take exception to a reasonable and real educational qualification and larger property qualification than at present. What the Indians do and would protest against is color distinction, disqualification based on account of racial difference. The Indian subjects of Her Majesty have been most solemnly assured over and over again that no disqualifications or restrictions will be placed upon them because of their nationality or religion. And this assurance was given and has been repeated upon no sentimental grounds, but on proof of merit. The first note was struck after it was ascertained beyond doubt that the Indians could be safely treated on a footing of equality, that they were most loyal to the throne and law-abiding, and that the British hold of India could be permanently maintained only upon those terms and no other. That there have been serious departures from the above assurance would, I submit, be no answer to the solid fact of its existence. I think those departures would be exceptions to prove the rule. They would not override it. For if I had time and space at my disposal, and if I were not afraid of tiring the readers by patience, I could quote innumerable instances in which the proclamation of 1858 has been strictly acted upon, and is even at the present moment being acted upon in India and elsewhere. And surely, this is not the occasion for a departure from it. I submit, therefore, that the Indians are perfectly justified in protesting against racial disqualifications and expecting that their protest will be respected. Having said so much, I venture to say on behalf of my fellow brothers that they would not think of objecting to any measure with regard to the franchise, which may be devised in order to keep the voters' roll clear of objectionable men, or to provide against preponderance of the Indian vote in future. I am confident that the Indians have no wish to see ignorant Indians who cannot possibly be expected to understand the value of a vote being placed on the voters' list. They submit that all are not such, and that such are to be found, more or less, in all communities. The object of every right-minded Indian is to fall in with the wishes of the European colonists as far as possible. They would rather forgo a crumb from the loaf than have the whole in opposition to the European colonists and from England. The object of this appeal is to beseech the legislators and the European colonists to devise or countenance only such a measure. If one is necessary, that would be acceptable also to those affected by it. To make the position clearer, I would take the liberty to show by extracts from a blue book what the most eminent colonists have thought about the question. Mr. Saunders, a member of the late Honorable Legislative Council, could go only thus far. The mere definition that these signatures must be in full and in the elector's own handwriting and written in European characters would go a long way to check the extreme risk of the Asiatic mind swamping the English. At page 7 of the same book, Captain Graves, the late protector of immigrants, says, "I am of opinion that only those Indians who have abandoned all claim for themselves and their families to a free return passage to India are justly entitled to the franchise." It should be noticed that Captain Graves spoke of the Indians recognized by his department, i.e. the indentured Indians. The then Attorney General and present Chief Justice says, "It will be noticed that the measure drafted by me contains clauses which have been adopted from the recommendations of the Select Committee, providing for the carrying out of the alternative plan mentioned in Mr. Saunders's letter, while the proposal for the special disqualification of aliens has not been considered advisable of adoption." At page 14 of the same book, he says again, "As regards the proposal to exclude from the exercise of the franchise all persons of every nationality or race which is not in every respect under the common law of the colony, this is a provision evidently aimed at the electoral rights at present enjoyed by the Indian and Creole population of this colony. As I have already stated in my report, serial number 12, I cannot recognize the justice or expediency of such a measure." The blue book in question contains much interesting reading on the franchise question and shows clearly that the idea of special disqualification was repugnant to the colonists at the time. The reports of the various meetings held in connection with the franchise show that the speakers have invariably argued that the Indians shall not be allowed to occupy this country, which has been won by European blood, and which has been made what it is by European hands, and show that the Indians are treated as intruders in the colony. As to the first statement, I can only say that, if the Indians are to be denied any privileges because they have not shed their blood for this land, the Europeans belonging to other states in Europe should not receive the same privileges. It could also be argued that the immigrants from England also have no business to trespass upon the special preserve of the first white settlers. And surely, if the shedding of blood is any criterion of merit, and if British colonists consider the other British dominions as portions of the British Empire, the Indians have shed their blood for Britain on many an occasion. The Chitral campaign is the most recent instance. As to the colony having been made by European hands and the Indian being an intruder, I beg to submit that all the facts show quite the opposite. Without any comments of my own, I shall now venture to quote extracts from the report of the Indian Immigrants Commission referred to above, for a loan of which I am indebted to the protector of immigrants. Says Mr. Saunders, one of the commissioners, at page 98, "Indian immigration brought prosperity, prices rose, people were no longer content to grow or sell produce for a song, they could do better. War, high prices for wool, sugar, etc., kept up prosperity and prices of local produce in which the Indians dealt." On page 99, he says, "I return to the consideration of the question as one of broad public interest. One thing is certain. White men will not settle in Natal or any other part of South Africa to become mere hewers of wood and drawers of water, rather than that they will leave us either for the vast interior or by sea. While this is a fact, our records prove, as do those of other colonies, that the introduction of colored labor which develops and draws out the hidden capabilities of the soil and its unoccupied acres opens out at the same time numerous unforeseen fields for the profitable employment of white settlers. Nothing more clearly proves this than our own experiences. If we look to 1859, we shall find that the assured promise of Indian labor resulted in an immediate rise of revenue, which increased fourfold within a few years. Mechanics who could not get work and were earning 5 rupees a day, and less found their wages more than doubled, and progress gave encouragement to everyone from the berg to the sea. But a few years later, a well-founded alarm arose that it would be suspended. The records are there to correct me if I'm wrong. Simultaneously, down went the revenue and wages. Immigration was checked, confidence vanished, and retrenchment and reductions of salaries was the main thing thought of. And yet another change, some years later in 1873, long after the discovery of diamonds in 1868, a fresh promise of renewed Indian immigration created its effect, and up again went the revenue, wages, and salaries, and retrenchment was soon spoken of as a thing of the past. Would that this was so now. Records like these ought to tell their own tale and silence childish race sentimentalities and mean jealousies. In further and collateral corroboration of the effect of introduction of colored labor on the welfare of white settlers, let me refer to a speech made by the Duke of Manchester, who has so identified himself with colonial interests. He had just returned from Queensland and told his hearers that the result of an agitation there, hostile to the introduction of colored labor, had proved most disastrous to those very white settlers who had hoped by checking the supply of imported colored laborers to destroy competition, which they wrongly imagined deprived the white settlers of work. At page 100, the same gentleman continues, "So far as concerns free Indian traders, their competition, and the consequent lowering of the prices of articles of consumption by which the public benefits, and yet, strange to say, of which it complains, it is clearly shown that these Indian shops have been and are most exclusively supported by the larger firms of white merchants, who thus practically employ these men to dispose of their goods. Stop Indian immigration, if you will. If there are not enough unoccupied houses now, empty more by clearing out Arabs or Indians, who add to the productive and consuming power of a less than half-peopled country. But let us trace results in this one branch of the inquiry, taking it as an example of others. Trace out how untenanted houses depreciate the value of property and securities, how after this must result stagnation in the building trade, and those other trades and estorts for supplies dependent on it. Follow out how this leads to a reduced demand for white mechanics, and with the reduction in spending power of so many, how fall of revenue is to be expected next, need of retrenchment, or taxation, or both. Let this result and others, far too numerous to be calculated on in detail, be faced, and if blind race sentimentalism or jealousy is to prevail, so be it. Dear friends, enough for today. Let's continue this article, The Indian Franchise, an appeal to every Briton in South Africa, in the next episode. Thank you for listening to Mahatma Gandhi Letters.